Welcome to Hard Beautiful Journey, where we embrace vulnerability as our superpower and let courage light our path. I'm Tiff Carson, here to share heartfelt stories of healing, grief, and resilience. Each week, I'll talk with guests from experts to everyday heroes about their journeys through adversity. Together, we'll uncover the beauty that emerges from life's challenges and how each experience can spark profound growth. Join us on this courageous journey of connection and transformation. Have you ever had life crack you wide open in a way that you never saw coming, and suddenly nothing about the world or yourself feels familiar anymore? That's the place that today's guest, Ayla Casey, found herself in. A successful leader in the beauty industry, Ayla's world shifted overnight when her husband was diagnosed with young-onset colon cancer. What followed was a sacred, painful, and life-defining journey through caregiving, loss, and a complete reimagining of how she moved through the world. But this isn't a story about pushing through. This is about staying with your grief, your body, your truth, and your voice. It's about honoring someone you love deeply without losing yourself in the process. And it's about learning to give language to the parts of your story that have been quietly tucked away just to get through the day. So before we begin, I want to gently ask you, what part of your story did you silence in order to survive? And is now the time to start listening to your own heart again? Let's take a deep breath and let's begin. Welcome to the podcast, Ayla. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, Tiff.
I am so grateful that you are here. What did your world look like before your husband's diagnosis, and how would you describe the woman that you were back then?
Well, pre-diagnosis was already a bit out of character because it was COVID.
Oh,
And I think the shift for me, even if I couldn't see it, had already begun really through our relationship. My husband and I met New Year's Day of 2016. And I feel like from just before we met, my life had begun already taking on this sort of irreversible turn towards myself within. And when COVID hit, he and I were on a business trip actually in Hawaii. We're based in New York City at the time. And because of the circumstances, like we were able to stay in Hawaii for a year and a half. And it was this really beautiful and strange time in life. And we moved back to New York so that I could focus on my career. I just finished my master's degree and I was very driven and focused on reinventing my career. I'd been working at a hair and skincare company for 10 years at that point. And while I loved it, it really felt like it was time for me to move on to my next thing. And indeed it was, but it was not the next thing that I thought it was going to be. Within about 5 weeks of landing back in New York, we were in the emergency room and facing emergency surgery to resect his colon. And, a very quick diagnosis happened, and our world was filled with chemotherapy and doctor visits. And him being a touring musician, that was something tremendously healing for him to continue doing. So the logistics of being able to make that happen for him while I was still working full time at my previous job became my existence. And really trying to create as much light as possible, but between us, but also for him, while he had something to look forward to. It really shifted his whole dynamic and the outlook on that he had on the future and himself and his body. And and within our home as well.
So, what did you experience in those early days of caregiving for him? And how did you start to witness your own emotions during that difficult time?
The first 6 months were very, very difficult. I was very it was hard for me to let go of the idea that I was going to have to stay at this job that I had my heart set on leaving.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was in that mindset, almost everything was a setback, like I couldn't fathom having to continue sort of traversing through that landscape. And at the same time, because everything in my world had become so acute, when we're talking life or death and we're talking chemotherapy and we're talking things that to me felt much louder than the world that I was professionally inhabiting,
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't wrap my heart around it anymore. I really um, couldn't make myself care about the work anymore, which was so difficult. And inside, I was in this really dark place of just not wanting to exist and feeling really hopeless. I wasn't taking care of myself in the ways that I would learn to. I was going to therapy because I felt like giving language to what I was going through was helpful, even if I couldn't yet see how I was going to be able to transform myself and my mindset. But I would say, I guess it was about 6 months in, my therapist said to me, he was like, you have got to do, like, you've got to take care of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I really knew what that meant. So I started with really, really basic, light physical activity. I think I was doing like post pregnancy workouts
Mm-hmm.
that were like 15 minutes long, but it was like the act of keeping a promise to myself that
Mm-hmm.
was so meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
And if it was a really hard and intense workout, I don't think I would have been able to stick with it with everything else that I was facing right then. Like everything was hard. I just needed something that was
Easy.
easable.
Yeah.
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 And I found that consistency like really quickly started to transform my body. Within a month, I felt different, I looked different, and it became sort of my lifeline. And then that practice transformed into a daily yoga practice shortly. Sort of, I got COVID and I couldn't work out anymore, but they told me I could do yoga because of the way that it affected my respiratory system. And
Mm-hmm.
so it just shifted into yoga, which I already had a deep practice, but had sort of lost touch with it. And it started at caring for myself, created space for me to start caring for my husband and for these causes that were so meaningful to my heart in a much deeper way, in a way that I never expected to be able to create so much spaciousness within myself
Mm-hmm.
and while in the midst of such an intense journey.
Mm-hmm. So you have said something, and I love how you put this. You've said that healing doesn't happen by bypassing, it happens by staying. What helped you make that conscious decision to stay with your pain instead of running from it or shutting it down like a lot of people do?
History. I went through all of the wrong ways to heal in previous chapters, and I have had a really difficult childhood and adolescence, and my problem solving, my coping was masking and numbing. And and like a lot of people, but I think in my case it was very intense. Like I was on the end of the polarity with addiction,
Mm-hmm.
and I got through my addiction. It was to opiates, and that was in college after a involuntary stay in a hospital, and I finished college, but I was still very broken, and I didn't have the tools to cope with what I was still dealing with, and it wasn't modeled to me. I'm not taking accountability. I'm just, I guess, giving myself grace for the way that I did attempt to cope with what I was going through.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I finished college, I got a job here in New York and with the beauty company, and I poured myself into my job and I became a workaholic.
Mm-hmm. Different
And
addiction.
yeah, it's another form of addiction, another form of numbing and
Mm-hmm.
masking.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that. I mean, I ultimately did it for 11 years, but I would say 5 years in, this shortly before I met my husband, I was so burnt out and so deeply disconnected from myself. I mean, my job required me to travel quite a bit. I was on the road maybe 22 to 25 days a month, some months.
Wow.
And drinking was a big part of the culture of that job. And I spent a lot of time just, under the guise of fun, was running away from myself. And I was considering leaving New York because I was like, I just can't do this anymore. But I didn't have any answers on what the remedy was because I still wasn't addressing the root beneath. I started making some small changes. I moved from Manhattan to Brooklyn, which was a tremendous relief for my nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a little bit quieter pace. And I started doing yoga. I stopped drinking alcohol and changed my diet, realizing that I was, you know, not eating with attunement for my body.
Mm-hmm.
And that those shifts created this spaciousness where I then met my husband 6 months later. And then that, like, this major shift happened for me when I met him shortly after we started dating. He asked me one day, right when we met up, he's like, "How are you?" I was like, "I'm fine." And he was like, "I am not asking for your platitudes. I want to know how you are because I care about the answer."
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first time that anyone had ever asked me and wanted them to know the real answer.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, that was the first time that I think I'd ever given myself permission to explore, how am I? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what's happening in here?
What's
Am
the
I
real
okay?
answer? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so that started this inquiry that I started asking other questions like, do I even like my job? Does this feel fulfilling and meaningful? And parts of it really were, and parts of it weren't. And so then I was like, okay, well, what would I shift if I could make shifts? And I was really lucky at that point to be in a position where a really supportive position where I was able to redesign my role to be what would be nurturing and feed me. And I applied for a master's degree in storytelling and media studies and was able to continue going to school or continue working full time while going to school. And in my mind, it was like, great. So when I finish school, then I'm going to change jobs and then everything's going to fall into place for me.
Mm-hmm.
Which, as I've already shared earlier, is not the way it didn't unfold the way that I had in my mind. But I do believe there was some sort of sacred wisdom to the way things unfolded, even if it has been a hard, beautiful journey.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to after the diagnosis. How did that all unfold for your family?
Well, he was diagnosed. We went to the emergency room 3 times and within 6 days, and colon cancer was not on our radar. It is I just wanna take the opportunity to say for any of your listeners that colon cancer has been traditionally known as an older person's disease, but it is not anymore
Hmm.
and is rising year over year in young people.
How old was he
And
when he was diagnosed?
38.
Okay. Hmm.
And that's 7 years before the recommended screening age for colon cancer, which has just been lowered to 45 in the US. I'm not sure about in Canada.
I'm going to have to look that up now. So thank you.
Mhm. So, a lot of times when young people present with symptoms, doctors will say, "Oh, you're too young." They're going to just chalk it up to hemorrhoids or IBS or a number of other conditions that can really be quite damaging for the delayed diagnosis. In my husband's case, he went in on one day and was back in 3 days later, and then by day 6 it had become an emergency where he had his whole colon was obstructed by a tumor.
Hmm.
And so we started chemotherapy, or he started chemotherapy, I guess 3 weeks after he got out of the hospital from surgery. And it was really, I mean, it was really challenging because the city, it was right in the middle of COVID. I mean, for everywhere, but particularly in New York City,
Hmm.
I don't have a frame of reference for how it was elsewhere, but here,
It was
and doing,
amplified there.
yeah,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
and any type of medical procedure during COVID was challenging because of the limited contact. They didn't want extra people around.
Hmm.
So at the time, like, we had just moved into a new apartment. That apartment turned out, we signed it sight unseen, and it looked nice from the photos, but unfortunately, when we got there, the building hadn't been well maintained, and there was a gas leak and a infestation and black mold, and so we ended up having to move, and like I moved us alone while he was in the hospital, and so there was just so much chaos happening at the same time. And i i I guess something that's really important to say about this time period is the ways in which we were able to support each other in in our own ways. I really feel strongly that, as I described earlier in our relationship, James was so instrumental in providing emotional support and strength
Hmm.
and allowing me or supporting me to cultivate that within myself. Because of him in our relationship, I carry his light and that strength forward today.
Hmm.
And that has allowed me to weather some of the more difficult storms here with a lot of courage and presence.
Hmm. Many people, I know I have, lose themselves in the story of their grief. How did you begin to reclaim your own story and your identity? And how do you now help others do that same work for themselves?
I think it starts with presence. And in the beginning of this cancer journey, I fell into this cycle of numbing again, using cannabis to sort of escape from this pain that I was running away from, and the fear of the future and the fear of being stuck and all of these things. And I got to this place where I knew that I could not continue numbing myself, because if our worst fears materialized and he did end up passing away, I would never forgive myself for spending the time that we had together high.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really challenging. I'll say perhaps as challenging as it was to quit opiates in my earlier life. This particular time with cannabis was really hard. And I tried for probably 10 months to quit smoking, and I just kept coming back to it. And then someone said to me, it was kind of an innocuous conversation. They wouldn't have known what kind of impact it was going to have on me. But they were talking about how like kind of the really specific ways that smoking vape pens can impact the lungs
Mm-hmm.
and what happens over just very short usage periods, like a few years of daily
Mm-hmm.
usage. And I imagined what that looked like inside of me. And also for my inability to really show up for James in the ways that I wanted to show up for him, and imagining that he was going to live through this. That's not me. That's not how I see myself. That's incongruent. And so I was able, that was like the, just after that, it was like a light switch. I was able to quit.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the next shift. I guess I had about a year and a half with him before he passed away, where I wasn't using cannabis and wasn't drinking. And our love story blossomed into this really deep and expansive and sort of like spiritually transcendent place. And I guess like there was this realization of how much more there is to life when you're present with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he passed away, I thought to myself, well, now's not the time to start numbing or masking. Like, now's the time to really feel it and dive into it.
Mm-hmm.
I know that if I were to numb and mask, it's going to be like a slingshot of this grief. I'm going to make it so much worse, and it's going to hit me in the face in a really painful way.
Mm-hmm.
So I stayed with it and allowed it to become a teacher. I have come to this realization that our feelings are these signals and internal messengers, and they want to be heard, they want to be felt. They don't want to be reacted to. Like, reaction is like pouring gasoline on them. And so I started writing. I started writing poetry, I started writing essays, and I also wrote to James. And I discovered that, well, I want to say that I discovered sort of this fluid relationship with hope through this journey, where when James was still here in the early part of his disease, he was diagnosed at stage 3. It's like you have this hope that everything's going to be okay, that this is just a blip in the timeline, and that in 6 months from now we're going to be back on track, whatever on track means. And then when when his diagnosis became terminal, I mean, we still had hope beyond hope that things were going to end for us in a, statistically unlikely way. And then hope sort of starts to transform, and you're like, okay, well, I'm hoping for less pain. I'm hoping for him to not be in pain. I'm hoping for him to be peaceful. And then when it gets to a more desperate place, you're hoping, or I was hoping that our love would somehow continue.
Mm-hmm.
And it really changed my relationship with spirituality, where I think if you'd asked me 5 years ago if I was spiritual, I would say, like, yeah, sure. But not sure that I had a very deep connection to what that meant, because I'm not sure that I needed to. I hadn't been faced with a situation that required me to develop and hone that
Mm-hmm.
skill set and that muscle and that relationship, I suppose. And in facing this journey with my husband, I am in a position where I am fairly estranged from my family of origin, and he was my family. And so it was my worst fear to be left alone on this planet without him. And so I knew that, or I started to feel this pull that I was going to have to reach in new ways. in order to feed that connection. And it's really been a really, like, not not to be cliche, but like such a beautiful journey, a hard beautiful journey over the last year and a half since he passed away, that the depth that still exists between us and the ways that our love story still continues. And I've found in my own spirituality that I have so many innate tools within myself, and there's so much access that I have in order to move through life with ease, and also to create not only expression, but to create light and to create support for others. And in creating that support through advocacy work that I still do with a number of organizations supporting colon cancer awareness. So in the ways that I am able to advocate for others to be able to take charge of their health, and as well as working with people to allow grief to be a catalyst for them and to become a source of personal power. These are ways that I get to keep saying I love you to the
Mm.
person who changed my life.
That is so
And
beautiful. I love that that's where you got to at the end of his journey here, is being able to continue your relationship with him in spirit in such a beautiful way. But you have also talked about metabolizing grief. Is that what you were doing in that time? Was really bringing it into your spirit and into your soul? It feels really cellular and really real. Is that what was happening?
absolutely, I believe that what we go through in our lives, in our relationships, and in our environments, like, it becomes consumption within our bodies, and we have to process and digest our experiences and our emotions and our environment the same way that we process and digest nutrients. And we have to release what doesn't nourish us, and we have to process what does nourish us. And that is the metabolism of grief. And I believe that when grief is allowed to move and be in motion, that is when it's able to transform back into love, back into joy, back into communal care, even self care. I think is such a big part of this journey that I've been on. That self care is self love, and the extent to which we show up for ourselves is the extent to which we are able to show up for those that we love and for the things that we care about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The one thing that I absolutely love about the work that you're doing now is how you are bridging music and healthcare in your advocacy. And can you tell us how that work came to be and how it keeps you connected not only to your husband's story, but to your own soul's purpose now?
Absolutely. My husband was a brilliant and talented musician, someone who could sing before he could talk, essentially, and was performing from very, very, very young ages. And so our whole relationship really, but in particular the last few years with cancer, music was such an important and healing part of both of our journeys. For him to continue to be able to show up on stage, it was a moment where he could be a version of himself that wasn't facing cancer. It was where nothing really mattered on stage except for that moment and that presence that was being created. And at the time, he hadn't released any music under his own name. I mean, he was somebody that toured with major pop stars and major acts, and hadn't put anything out under his own name. And this was a big part of his legacy that became very urgent with his diagnosis. And so we set out to, I mean, it was something that was important to him, and I can't take credit for any of the music at all, but my support was really um, in building everything around him, the container and the scaffolding around to leverage his art as part of his story. And he recorded 2 albums during that time frame, and one of which funds for colon cancer, and both of them were tied into campaign efforts with a few other organizations to share his story and to reach others. And so since that time frame, I've continued that work. I've continued sharing his story. I have continued working with the artists that he performed with that loved him, artists like Dave Matthews and Trey Anastasio and a number of others, to continue this work in sharing James's story, animating his story among the music community and bridging that with the medical world and a number of doctors that we built bonds with over the years, and creating events where people can ask questions to doctors, and at the same time we can bring together these communities through silent auctions and merchandise and dialogue that hopefully, you never know, the way advocacy, you never know when it's going to reach somebody and in what moment in their journey that it's going to, that seed is going to germinate. But hopefully these conversations are reaching people that, well, I know they are, because I'm still getting messages that people are getting screened because they saw James's story.
Mm-hmm.
And because of his story, they caught polyps that could have become cancerous if they hadn't have been caught. And that's really what this is about. If even one person doesn't have to go through what James went through, then it's all worth it.
Mm-hmm. You help others build lives that are rooted in meaning. What does that look like in practice, though? Especially for someone who feels like they have lost all sense of direction or belonging, even after a major loss like you've endured.
I really relate myself to that. I feel as though part of the most disorienting element of this loss has been feeling very unmoored or unanchored, and not knowing where to go in the world. And for me, it was really about tapping in to self and getting really, really close to asking these hard questions and getting close to me. Who am I, and what lights me up? What brings me passion? And the work that I do with others is very, it's clearing away all of the things that we have endured in this, human body, because everything is stored in our bodies, and getting really clear in the root, like, what brings me joy, what brings me passion. And if I have to live in this world where this is one version of my worst nightmare, how can it still be joyful, and how can it still be beautiful? Because hard things are going to happen to us no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
But how can we have space for presence and joy at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it is really linked to and centered around legacy work. My husband started to think about his legacy when he was facing a terminal diagnosis, but we don't have to wait until we're close to death, or we think we're close to death, because the thing is, we never know how far away we are from death. Like, I thought about this often while he was here, that it was only really so scary because we knew statistically that he was much closer to dying than, say, me. But like, I could walk outside today and not come home.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really, my work became tied to my legacy. What do I want to be remembered for? How do I want to carry myself in the world? And there are a number of practices that we all have access to in order to remember who we are from a real deep intrinsic self level before we went through all of the things that have shaped who we know ourselves to be today. And a lot of times it's shaped by pain and it's shaped by trauma.
Mhm.
And those things can definitely inform how we want to move through the world, but it doesn't have to define us.
Mm-mm. I know when my brother passed away and my marriage ended, I had a really hard time accepting that I should feel joy, that I was allowed to feel it anymore. So it can feel risky, I guess, to some people, or just that they're not worthy of it anymore for some reason. How did you begin to trust that you could feel joy? And what are some of those other small things in your day that bring you joy now after this loss?
I'm so glad you asked this question because this has been like a muscle that I've been strengthening and exercising because I totally agree with you that it resonates that I didn't feel that I deserved it either. I mean, even while James was here, I took a leave of absence from my job and I felt like I didn't deserve to enjoy myself during that time frame. I felt like I should be laying on the floor crying or in a puddle in the closet in the dark. I
Mm-hmm.
just didn't feel like I was able to be present during that time frame and deserve to enjoy the time with James that taking a leave of absence would allow me to. But really started with the smallest of actions. Like nutrition and food is a really big part of it. Um, being really kind to my body and really kind to myself and really understanding. I think we have this innate ability to self soothe and self mother and even self bother
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I can be the person that I've always needed. And it's not about isolating ourselves, but it's about cultivating that inner strength. And I started doing really little things. Like, I'm going to share kind of a funny, weird story, but I used to always wear plain underwear, just like plain, solid, boring underwear.
Yeah.
And then after James passed away, I was like, you know what? Like, I want to order these fun, silly prints. And every morning after I get out of the shower, I'm going to pick whichever print feels like my personality that day.
Yeah.
And it's going to give me this little spark of joy
Yeah.
that's going to stay with me throughout the day. And
Because you
when
know
I
they're there.
yeah, totally. And like when I go to the grocery store and check out, like I'm gonna have just a little bit brighter a spark than I would have had without that.
Yeah.
And so I've started to find little ways to just embody those little bits of joy. And I started doing like silly things like I wish I had another one nearby, but I'll make collages
Oh, I love that.
and it's just like, I don't need to make art for any reason other than the fact of just like seeing what wants to be expressed.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be something that I do while I'm listening to a podcast or watching a movie or it doesn't have to be this thing that takes 3 hours. Like I can just spend 20 minutes cutting up paper and seeing what comes out. And it
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of times makes me laugh.
Yeah. A lot of it comes back to what we liked and enjoyed and loved when we were kids, too. Like when you sit back and think about those things that you loved doing, one of those for me was singing at the top of my lungs into a spatula. Like, give me a spatula and look out. I am going to do Oh Canada at the top of my lungs. And so now when I'm having like an off day or I'm sad or something, I will crank a song in my car and it's on. Like it is on. And so it's just finding those micro moments in your day to shift your energy. It just goes such a long way in that grief journey.
Absolutely. I think that a big part of this has been reclaiming my voice. Throughout my life, I have felt like I don't deserve to take up space or have needs or what have you. And I think in a lot of ways that reached this culmination with the caregiving journey. And I realized I do have needs and I have to answer my needs in order to be able to show up for the person who's most important to me and the most urgent thing in my life right now, which is cancer. And so I started to have to really start listening to myself and hearing, like, what is it that I need? And it started with physical movement. And then it grows. I really love the metaphor of thinking of it as a muscle, because you get stronger and stronger, and then you can start hearing better what your needs are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So let's talk about how you work with people. I'm going to put up this screen that shows more info. So this is where you can check out everything that Ayla is doing. And so her website is alchemyforhumanhearts.com, and she's on Instagram, Ayla C. Casey. And your Substack is alchemyforhumanhearts.substack.com. So what can they find when they go to these places?
So I would love to invite everybody to check out my website. I have a book that I'm working on. It's the Little Book to Remember, and it includes a living body of work of all of these practices that we've been talking about, where you can strengthen that muscle to hear yourself and to start feeding yourself and nurturing yourself. And that is, I guess, the quickest way that you can start this work. Otherwise, I work with people in a coaching and mentoring capacity for caregivers that want to cultivate more spaciousness in order to be able to be there for their loved ones as deeply as possible. I'm also an end of life doula, and I do legacy work with people that are facing end of life, or also wanting to honor themselves or a loved one. And on my Substack, you can learn more about my journey and follow my writing, and also pick up creative practices and rituals that honor this work.
You have inspired me to start my own Substack. So just so you know, thank you. Because I loved reading what you have on there, and everybody should go and check that out. So I have a question for you. If James could witness the woman that you've become and the work that you're doing and the lives that you're touching, what would you most want him to know right now?
I think that I would just want to express, and I want to say that I do express this to him all the time, how deeply grateful I am for the seeds that he planted in me and in the world that continue to flower and bloom, that his garden and the garden that we planted together, may it continue thriving for many seasons to come.
That is beautiful. If you've been holding your story quietly because the world felt too loud, or the pain felt too big, or you just didn't know where to begin, I want you to know this: you are not alone. Ayla's journey reminds us that grief doesn't just take something from us, it asks something of us. It asks us to keep showing up even when our voice shakes, to keep breathing even when everything hurts, to keep loving even when the person we love is no longer here. And in the process, we begin to remember parts of ourselves that we thought we lost too. The soft parts, the strong parts, the sacred parts. So if you're someone on that path, whether you're in the messy middle of caregiving, or deep inside the silence of grief, or just trying to recognize your reflection again, I want to say that you're not behind, you're not broken, and you are most definitely not alone. Your story deserves to be held, your voice deserves to be heard, and your healing, no matter how long it takes, is worthy of tenderness and time. This is your reminder that it's okay to take up space in your own life again. And like Ayla so beautifully teaches us, sometimes the first step back to yourself is simply telling the truth. If today's conversation moved something in you, if it stirred your own grief, reminded you of a love that you're still holding, or simply made you feel seen, please take a moment to follow Ayla on Instagram and explore her beautiful work at her website. All of the links will be in the show notes. Ayla, your presence is a gift in this world, and I am truly honored that you shared this space with me today and my audience. And if you're on your own healing journey, especially if you're feeling like you've silenced your truth just to keep going, I want you to know that there are places for you to exhale to. You can download my free guided meditation to help you come back to your breath and your body. You can listen to more stories like this on my podcast, Hard Beautiful Journey, and you can join my private Facebook group to connect with others that are walking this path. And I am beyond excited to finally share that I am hosting my very first Healing Heart Retreat that is happening this October in Canmore, Alberta, and tickets will go on sale July 8th. This retreat is for anyone who is ready to feel seen again, who is ready to speak again and come home to themselves, surrounded by beauty, breath, and the kind of community that we all deserve. You'll hear much more in the coming weeks, but for now, mark your calendar, and I'd be so honored to hold space for you there. We are not meant to heal alone, and you don't have to. Ayla, thank you again from the bottom of my heart for being here today and sharing your hard, beautiful journey and your heart with us. I'm truly honored.
Thank you so much, Tiff. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for being here for this episode of Hard Beautiful Journey. I hope today's episode inspired you to embrace your own vulnerabilities and recognize the strength within you. Remember, every story of resilience adds to the beauty of our shared journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and leave a review. Your support helps me spread hope and healing to even more listeners. Until next time, keep shining your light and embracing the beauty in your journey. Bye-bye.